Tudo bom? Eu não falo bem português, então I'll have to switch to English. I can't give a technical talk in Portuguese. I can mostly swear in Portuguese, which wouldn't be very appropriate for this audience, I don't think. My slides are online. The URL is on the screen. You can find me on Twitter at Rasmus. So, I lost the picture. Oh no. Here it comes. All right, fixed. So, I am from Greenland originally. Oh, slow internet connection. 1 second. I'm switching to local. I had it remote, sorry. All right. Where are we? We are in Sao Paulo. Here we go. Sorry about that. Okay, here we go. So, I am originally from northern Greenland, way up there. About as different from Brazil as you can possibly get. The town I'm from, and I wasn't even in the town, I was from outside the town, had about 200 people in it. This was me. I was playing with technology even when I was a baby. This, my parents and me on a dog sled in Greenland. This was our house. Nobody around. It was very far. The city was down the hill, down there. And down there lived about 200 people. Lots of icebergs. And that's downtown. Kekatasuak is the name of the city. I am probably the only person that you will ever meet from there. So, anyway. In the early 90s, I actually went to Brazil, to Porto Alegre, in 1991. Before the web, it was quite difficult to find my way to Porto Alegre. There was no Google Maps. I didn't really know where Porto Alegre was. I flew to Rio and figured I would find my way there somehow. It was a very long bus ride. Anyway, the web in the 90s, and when I was in Porto Alegre, was basically Gopher. That was the closest thing we had to the web, which looked like that. It was text only, mostly used at universities. It was not very advanced. It wasn't until 1993 where the first graphical web browser came out, Mosaic, which changed the world. It certainly changed my world, because as soon as I saw that, I told the Brazilian company I was working for, I was like, we have to stop everything, focus on the web. They didn't quite agree, so I ended up quitting, and I was living in Mountain View in Silicon Valley at the time, working for this Brazilian company, and I quit my job and moved to Toronto, and started doing web development for various companies. Web development in 1993 looked like this. This was CGI bins, written in C, not very nice to write. I mean, you have HTML embedded inside C. It was really, really difficult to deploy new versions. Every little tiny change to the look and feel, you have to recompile and redeploy to the web server. And CGI was also too slow. You have to fork and exec a new process for every request. That just didn't work. Most of the world, at that point, moved to Perl and to this CGI PM. So it's a Perl module that implemented CGI. It looks a little bit better than the C version, but it's still HTML kind of inside Perl code. I didn't like this either. I wanted to separate the look and feel the UI from the business logic of my web applications. So I wanted code that looked more like this, at least at the templating level. So I wanted just HTML to look like HTML with a few special tags that would then call back into my back-end business logic, which was written in C. The way I saw the web in 1994 was you would write your business logic in a compiled, statically typed, or strongly typed language like C or C++, and then you would have a little bit of templating to give you the look and feel and the display UI. So that was my entire concept for PHP, was a C API for the web. Unfortunately, the world didn't agree with me. Nobody wanted to write C code. The web was growing so fast, and there weren't enough C developers around. Everybody just wanted the templating system. And they wanted more and more tags to be available to the templating system. So my focus kind of changed at that point, saying, okay, well, forget this C API thing. Nobody wants to write C code. Let's focus on the actual problem itself. And it was much more than just PHP. It was the whole ecosystem that became my focus at that point. I like to tell people that LAMP wasn't an accident. It didn't just sort of magically happen that Linux, Apache, MySQL, and PHP worked well together in those early days. I and other people spent quite a bit of time making sure that all these pieces fit together really well. I worked very hard on embedding PHP into Apache. I also worked quite a bit on databases, making sure that PHP talked to databases quite well. The first database I used was something called Mini SQL from a very smart guy named David Hughes in Australia. His database didn't have any kind of cursors or any type of way of limiting the results that came back. So I had to invent the limit clause, which I added to Mini SQL, which then when MySQL came around a couple of years later and wanted to be sort of the standard PHP database, they asked me, how can we get you to support MySQL? And they said, well, make it easy for me to build an extension. And they said, no problem. We have cloned the Mini SQL API. All you have to do is a search and replace in VI from MSQL to MySQL, and it'll just work. I was like, okay, that's cool. But I also have these limit queries. Like, what's that? It's like, it's something I made up. I like putting limit 10 at the end of my SQL queries, so I only get 10 results back, even if there are thousands. Because for a web page, if I'm only going to show 10 results, I don't want to sit and read across a slow TCP IP socket all those other results that I'm just going to throw away. It's like, well, okay, that makes sense. So that's why MySQL added limit to their database as well. And others, Postgres has gotten it now, and other databases have started to pick it up. And I actually find that quite funny, that this very non-standard hack has survived this long. But the whole point of this was, I spent a lot of time not just on PHP, but on the whole ecosystem and making all the pieces talk to each other. I also spent a lot of time thinking about how can we make this easy and accessible to everyone. I absolutely hated some of the CS folks and computer science folks that said that unless you have a computer science degree, you really shouldn't be programming. If you don't know exactly what you're doing all the time, you shouldn't be programming. If the web was built by computer science PhDs only, it would be terrible. If the web was only built like guys like me, well, I don't have a computer science PhD, but still, if it was only built by really geeky engineer types and CS types, the web would be a horrible place. The web is fun and dynamic and amazing because everybody can put their content up there. It's also terrible and horrible because of that, but you can't have one without the other. So I spent a lot of time making it accessible. One of those things I did was making sure that shared hosting worked really well with PHP, and that ISPs could put hundreds of virtual hosts running PHP on a single Apache instance. This is one of these things that Perl got wrong with their mod Perl. They made mod Perl way too powerful. If you write a mod Perl script, you can take over the entire web server. You can hook into the request parsing, for example, and take other virtual domain requests for yourself. So an ISP couldn't provide mod Perl on the same Apache instance as was shared by other people. So they completely screwed up their shared hosting strategy, or they didn't have a shared hosting strategy. So mod Perl never really caught on because of that. I also spent a lot of time on scale and scaling down and making sure it was really, really easy to sort of get started. When you first try something with a new technology, if the first thing you try works, it's empowering, right? If you try to write Hello World in Java, your first attempt is going to give you this massive stack trace that tells you, you're an idiot, you're an idiot, you're an idiot, you're an idiot, 30 times. It's like, I just tried one thing, and this thing gives me this whole page of errors. That's not encouraging. That's telling you, you don't know anything, you don't know enough even to write a Hello World script in Java. Hello World in PHP is you open up your editor, you type Hello World, you save. You run that in PHP, it's a perfectly valid PHP script, out comes Hello World. Awesome, right? Or you open up your HTML file and you want to just add the time to the page. So you put a little tag in your HTML that has the time, and you reload the page in the browser, hey, the time showed up. Maybe the format's slightly wrong because you got the arguments wrong, so you go back to the documentation, get the arguments right, and hey, the time still shows up. Try to imagine how you would write that in Java. How would you take an HTML page and embed the current time in that page in Java? Not easy. And there are probably, for the Java developers in the room, we can come up with 10 different solutions, and it would be a very long conversation on how to do it. In PHP, it is absolutely trivial to do stuff like that, and that was the whole point of PHP. Getting it to scale way down to anybody, and also having it scale up so that really large companies wouldn't have to switch, that they could keep scaling up. It is not any easier to write an enterprise-level application in PHP than in any other language. But it's not impossible. You face the same problems that you face in any other language at that level. It's a hell of a lot easier to get started with PHP, though. And that's really, really difficult, to build a solution that scales from the weekend warrior all the way up to Wikipedia, for example. So, today, we're almost at PHP 7.3. The first betas are out. Within a month or so, we should have PHP 7.3. A couple of new features for the PHP devs in the room. A flexible here doc. Basically, it just means that you can put the ending block indented. You couldn't do that before. It looked kind of ugly. Whatever spacing you have to the left of it will be ignored from the rest of it. So basically, there would be no space in front of bar in the actual output. So it's just a more logical here doc. Another minor feature, sometimes people use a continue inside a switch, which is inside a loop, and it's a little confusing what that continue might actually do. So it's a little bit more obvious now, because a continue inside a switch is the same as a break. And some people don't realize that, and they actually meant to continue the outside loop. So PHP 7.3 has a warning that tells you, wait a second, did you actually mean to use continue here? Because it doesn't really make sense. You can also add references to lists now. You couldn't do that before. So in this case, $B is now a reference to the value 2 there, both in the long form and the short form version of lists. You can now have commas in function calls, so you can have a trailing comma here for arguments. That was just something we missed. In PHP 7.2, we added the ability to have trailing commas everywhere, but we forgot function calls, so we've added those now in 7.3. There's also a new monotonic timer function, HR time. A monotonic timer is a timer that always goes forward. There are times when, if, for example, the system administrator might change the clock, or NTP might, if the clock is running a little fast in your computer, NTP might move it backwards slightly, or leap seconds, or anything where basically the time can jump. If that messes up your code, and it can, if you're timing something, or if you have something that's very sensitive to time always moving forward, it can be really catastrophic if time stops or even moves backwards. A monotonic timer always moves forward. For those of you using FPM, there's a new get status function where you can get some idea of what's happening in your FPM server, which is kind of cool. There's also a new isCountable function. You may have noticed, for those of you who have already upgraded to 7.2, in 7.2, count is a little bit more fussy, and it gets upset if you try to count something that isn't actually countable. And people seem to do that a lot. They count all kinds of things, and count always just returns 1. If it's not something that's countable, as well, I guess there's one of them. But it's usually indicative of a bug. So in 7.2, there was a new warning saying, what the hell? This thing isn't countable. Why are you calling count? That forced people to add a bunch of checks to see if the thing they're about to count was actually countable. So in 7.2, we saw a lot of this type of code. If it is an array or it's an instance of countable, then I can call count. That seemed like a lot of code. So we added isCountable to make that a little bit easier in 7.3. There's also a new array key first, array key last set of functions. We found a lot of people were using reset and end to get the first and last elements, but that also moves the cursor, the array cursor, and sometimes if you're doing it on something that you can't actually, you don't have an actual variable holding it, then you would actually get a warning saying, hey, you're trying to reference something that's not a reference. This one just acts on the values itself, so this can be called on anything. There's also a whole bunch of new DCE and SCCP optimizations, which probably doesn't mean anything to anybody in here, and I'll explain what that is in a little bit. Other changes, the internal PCRE library that does regular expressions has been upgraded to version 2, and a couple of other minor changes. Things that might break your code, yeah, PCRE 2 might break some very, very complicated regular expressions. If you find after upgrading to 7.3 some of your regular expressions don't work, have a look at the differences between PCRE and PCRE 2 and see why it might have broken. In our, I don't know how many millions of lines of code at Etsy where I work, none of our regular expressions broke in 7.3, but there's still the possibility. For full details on how to upgrade to 7.3, please read our upgrading guide carefully. There's a lot more in there than what I described today. If you're writing extensions, we also have a document that explains how the extension API has changed in 7.3. Performance-wise, we can kind of see how things have progressed over the years. If anyone in here is still on PHP 5.3 or 5.4, first of all, what the hell are you doing here? You should be home or back in the office upgrading. But second, you're kind of lucky because you have some amazing performance boosts coming your way with very little effort, actually. Suddenly, your site will get 2 or 3 times faster just by upgrading PHP. And you can see from 2009 to now 2018, it's a good 3.5 times faster, at least for WordPress 4.9.8. And the latency as well is much, much better. So you can see the latency has been dropping from 130 milliseconds to serve up the front page of WordPress down to 38 milliseconds. That's some major performance boosts. To me, even more important than sort of the straight line performance or the single request performance is actually the memory use has dropped dramatically because of all kinds of neat tricks we're doing in PHP 7. So what used to take 140 megabytes now takes 15, right? Almost a 10 times decrease in the amount of memory needed to serve up the same code. What this means is if you're hosted, like if you're doing cloud hosting, your instances, you can either make them much, much smaller, or you can turn off 2/3 of them if you upgrade from PHP 5 to PHP 7, just because the request density capabilities of PHP 7 is so much higher. You can put so much more traffic on the same size instance. All right, I promised to talk a little bit about DCE and SCCP and also escape analysis. This is getting pretty technical. This is getting into compiler optimization, but I think it's cool, and I'm going to try to explain it in sort of an easy way to understand. Say we have this code here, this function that sets a equals to 1 and returns 0. That assignment, a equals 1, is meaningless, right? Because in PHP, if you're modifying a global variable, you have to declare that. So this is a local variable. We know this. So you're creating a local variable, then you don't use it, and then you return. There's absolutely no point in that assignment. So PHP 7.1, if you look at the bytecode, which is kind of the assembly language behind PHP, the opcodes we call them, it happily says, okay, assign 1 to A and return 0. PHP 7.2 and 7.3 generates opcodes that doesn't even have that assignment anymore because it looked at it and said, this is useless, we can get rid of it. Of course, if you have less opcodes to execute, it's going to run faster. If we try to trick it a little bit, so here we pass in 4 strings, and then we concatenate those 4 strings, then we overwrite it with 0, and we return X. Here you can see in 7.1, we have a bunch of opcodes to do all these operations and all these concatenations and assign and everything. In PHP 7.2 and 7.3, that goes away completely. We just take in the 4 arguments. These are actually no ops. They don't take any execution time. It's just indicating where those 4 passed in arguments are. And we don't even assign anything to X because we figured out that, hey, no matter what, it always returns 0. So we also don't create $X anymore. So far, we could do everything in 7.2. This part as well, even if we try to trick it again, it figures out there's no point in $B. So all it does is sets A plus equals 3 and returns that result. But in 7.3, we have enhanced this stuff quite a bit more. So if you have more complicated code like this, that shuffles things around between different variables and arrays, PHP 7.2 isn't smart enough to optimize that. In 7.3, it figures it out. In 7.3, we figure out that this is actually the same as just assigning A equals Y. These first 2 lines are meaningless in this particular code. So that's all we generate. And one of the things we use is escape analysis, which I'll try to illustrate here. So here we have an empty class A, and then we have a function, foo, that instantiates A, sets a property to the passed-in value X, and returns X. Now, PHP 7.3 looks at this and says, this class A is meaningless, we don't need it. The function itself doesn't do anything, right? It instantiates this meaningless class. sets a property, but it doesn't matter because there's no way that this can escape out of this context. So it just says x equals the passed in argument, which is what this means, and then we return it. We return x. So these two lines of code have been eliminated by the optimizer. If we provide something that could possibly escape, so if the class we instantiate has a constructor or a destructor, it means that instantiating the class can actually change something outside of this function. In that case, we can't optimize. And that's what escape analysis means. Can this action escape the context? If it cannot, then we can eliminate it, we can optimize. If something can escape, then we can't optimize. And it also looks further. For example, if you walk through this code logically, the optimizer has figured out that no matter what, it always returns 0. And it eliminates all the other lines of code, all the conditions, all the assignments get eliminated, and all the optimizer says return 0. And we can get really ridiculous. We can have a huge chunk of code like this, and the optimizer reads this and says, all this does is echo 1, return 4. Everything else we can throw away. The end result of all this, that you may not have understood, is that if your code runs dramatically faster under 7.3 versus, for example, PHP 7.1, your code was really bad. Because it means the optimizer has gone in and deleted most of your code because most of your code was absolutely meaningless. And you're doing completely useless stuff in your code. So if your PHP 7.3 code is super, super fast, I wouldn't advertise that on Twitter or anywhere. Because people will look at you and say, okay. You have been optimized. It's not something to be proud of. But it does mean that, especially really old code, runs extremely well under PHP 7.3. Because, yes, this particular case is extreme, but there are other cases where removing a couple of opcodes here and there in the critical section of something that gets hit a lot really can make a difference. All right, another thing I've been working on is static analysis for PHP. And I started a project called Fan. You can find it on GitHub, Fan. Easy to install and get going. Oops. Just composer require, fan. You can make a very small config file that basically says all my source code is in /source, and I might have some composer classes under vendor. This exclude analysis directory list basically says, I want to import all these classes, but don't report errors in other people's code. I'm only interested in static analysis errors for my particular code under the source directory. You can, of course, set these directories to whatever you like. Then you run vendor bin fan, and it'll do an analysis of your code. It checks for all kinds of things. Many mistakes, common mistakes in PHP are caught by fan. If you've never run fan on your code before, you should. You will get hundreds of errors most likely. Some of them are false positives. Some of them are a little bit strict, and you can configure fan to turn off some of these warnings. And you can massage it to the point where it fits your programming style. Some of the things it does, it allows you to do enhanced type annotations. So for example, here we have a method that can take either a string or an integer as the first argument. With native PHP types, we don't support unions at the PHP level. So if something can take one type or another, you have to do it via static analysis, via something like fan. At the PHP level, we also only support arrays. we don't support typing the contents of the arrays. With fan, you can do that. You can say, this array is actually an array of integers. And we also support shaped arrays in fan, which means that you can specify exactly which keys an array should have. And if someone passes in an array that doesn't have the keys mode and max, then it's an error. So if we run this, and we have these 3 calls, these 3 calls are all fine, because we pass a string. Here we pass an int. This matches the signature. But here, the first argument is an array. The type annotation says it has to be a string or an int. So this is the fan error that we get. Argument 1, named union, is an array, but it takes int or string. That gives you an idea of what these fan errors might look like for your code. You can write plugins for fan as well. There's a whole bunch of sample plugins included. For example, the $$ plugin. If you don't want anyone in your company to use $$ in PHP, you can write a very simple, you can use the fan plugin to basically give a warning. Say, hey, no $$ magic at this company. I happen to like $$ magic because I came up with it. But I have to admit, if you have more than $2 anywhere in your code, if you have 3 or 4, yikes. I probably shouldn't have made that possible, but it was so easy to implement. And you can have as many $ as you want in a row, but good luck figuring out what that code actually does. There's also a daemon mode, which I think is pretty cool. And daemon mode basically runs in the background, and you can hook it up to your editor. So you can hook it up to Vim and get PHP Storm-like static analysis checks. Every time you save a file, it'll give you an error. And I have a very simple little video that just, so I don't have to type. So basically, showing I have a couple of plugins enabled, edit my code, I start the fan daemon, then I edit my code, and I add some mistakes here. And you can see as soon as I try to save from within Vim, and here I said this should return an integer, but it doesn't. So it's a very cool way of getting errors, PHP errors, directly on save, or in any other editor. It's a very simple little fan client program any editor can run. So if you've been sort of envious of some of the things you can do in PHP Storm, but you're a hardcore VI or Emacs fan, you can get some of the functionality through this fan daemon, which is pretty cool. All right. Last cool tool, PHP Spy. This is a new low overhead sampling profiler, which I really like. What you can do with this is you can sample a running PHP program and see what the hell is this thing doing. So a very simple example, if I start a program that says sleep for 1 second, and you can set the sampling frequency, it's in nanoseconds, so we have to set a lot of them. To every 200 milliseconds, I want to check, what is this program doing? So every 200 milliseconds, I get a stack trace that says, well, we're sleeping, and you see we have 5 of these, right? So every 200 milliseconds, because we're sleeping for 1 second, I get 5 stack traces. Normally, you check more often than every 200 milliseconds. So what you can do is you can run it on an existing application that's already running. In this case, it was WordPress. And you get a bunch of stack traces that look like this. This may not seem very useful. However, there are some included scripts that let you create a flame graph from this output. So what you can get is something like this. So this was me running PHP Spy on fan itself, as fan was doing an analysis on some code. And here I can go in and I can see what took a lot of time during my fan analysis. And I can sort of zoom in and see all the different stages. I can zoom in here as well and get closer and actually see that here was some kind of post-order analyze. At Etsy, it was one of my coworkers at Etsy that wrote PHP Spy. We use it quite a bit, especially when things are doing strange things. We have cron jobs written in PHP. We have gearman jobs that run a long time written in PHP. And sometimes these things just run forever. And we're thinking, why is this taking so long? We can attach PHP Spy to this running process and get a nice little flame graph. And often, it's just one big block that says it's stuck talking to a database, or it's stuck in this particular place. Or it might be toggling between two places and it's stuck in an infinite loop. But it's really, really nice to get this stack trace and see where it's spending all its time to find bugs. So it's been one of our most useful new tools that we have. And I'm out of time, right on time, I think. So, like I said, the talk is here. Hopefully you have a few interesting questions and we have time for those. Thank you.